So Sentinels is really commonly played this set, and there's a lot of reasons why, which is what we're going to break down in this video. But basically almost every single reroll wants to use Sentinel as the front line, whether it be that you're playing one that fits really easily with Sentinels, like the Renata reroll comp that is, pretty egregious. A lot of people know this one and it's pretty hard to deal with. But even comps like Zeri, which normally used to be played with Watchers, is now often max capped version played with Sentinels, and even stuff like Tristana reroll is often played now with Sentinels. So why is it that Sentinel is getting so much love and some of the other frontline traits that are dedicated like Watcher and Bruiser aren't getting as much attention? So that's what we're going to talk about today, and it's going to kind of give you a little bit more of an intuition of why certain traits and certain units end up becoming stronger as the set progresses, and that's what we're going to be talking about. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. I usually do guides or reactions or for fun content, but usually informative educational content for TFT. So if you're trying to rank up or get better at TFT, this is a good channel to help you get started, especially if you're a beginner player. So thanks for all the support for everybody that has subscribed. We're getting close to our 10,000 sub goal. And also, I do have my store active, so if anybody sees art that they like, I sell art on the side, so you can do that as well. There will be a new art piece. Working on wood carving on stream, so I'm going to be posting those onto the store as well as soon as they are done. So now, let's talk about Sentinels. But before we talk about Sentinels, I want to talk about just tanks in general. So let's just say a tank. This is something that I talked about in some of my earlier guides when I was talking about different traits and itemizations for the traits. But when you're thinking about a tank basically has three main things that they can use in order to keep them alive, right? As a tank, you usually have either some form of HP, you have some sort of armor / MR, so something that reduces the amount of damage that you're taking via the form of resistances is what you're normally calling these. And then the other one is durability. These are the three main tank aspects, or the three main aspects of a tank, and you're usually trying to balance these three aspects to get the most out of your tank, right? Without any HP, it doesn't matter how much armor and durability you have, you will die in very few hits. If you have a bunch of HP and a bunch of durability, you don't have any resistances, you'll be taking a lot of extra damage for no reason. And a lot of times if you don't have any durability, this one's one that sometimes you can do without. It's more of like a bonus stat in a lot of cases, but it works well in conjunction with the other two. And typically as a tank, you want to have all three of these traits being active on your main tank in order to maximize their tankiness. So when you think about the frontline traits, or the dedicated frontline traits in TFT, there was always a trait that is dedicated to each of these main tank aspects. So Sentinels, if you read Sentinels, they gain armor and MR. If you read about Watchers, Watchers gain durability. And then, if you can guess, there's one more frontline trait, which is Bruisers. And what do they give you? HP. So there's typically going to be a frontline trait that tries to maximize in one of those aspects. And a lot of times you fill in the gaps by items or other means in order to make the tank very effective. When you're thinking about these frontline traits, ideally, all three of them should work in some way, right? If you play around Sentinels, a lot of times, if you give them a bunch of HP and a bunch of durability, then they will become giga tanks or main tanks, and you can itemize and play around them very effectively. There's lines that play around Alawi, for example, lines that play around some of the lower costs as reroll options as well. If you're trying to play around Watchers, for example, because they gain a bunch of durability, a lot of times HP and armor are things that will work out really well. Garen is an exceptional unit, and often you build him with a bunch of HP because of his emissary bonus as well, but often you'll see people put armor on the Garen as well to make sure that he fits really nicely as a frontline unit. But additionally, there's other options for rerolls that have been prevalent, especially with Vander. A lot of times people look at Vander and he'll be very hard to deal with. And then lastly, there's Bruisers, which, come in different shapes and forms, but usually have a lot of HP. So with that massive amount of HP, you try and scale that in some way of giving them, like, some form of resistances in order to help them not take too much damage per hit. Because if they have so much HP and then you reduce the amount of damage that you're taking with something like resistances or durability, then they can live very long. Somebody that really falls into this field is Elise, because Elise not only gets the Bruiser HP for being a Bruiser, but also has Form Swapper, which is another trait that gives a form of durability. So a lot of times building armor as well as some other stuff on Elise helps out, but we'll talk about Elise a little bit different because there's a lot of aspects that makes a good tank. Something that I do want to talk about when evaluating certain front lines it's not only a matter of just looking at the static traits that they give. A lot of times you have to evaluate it in different ways, right? You have to evaluate it. So let's say we're evaluating a trait and we're trying to see if it's strong or not, right? When you're evaluating, there is the quality of the trait, right? The trait plays a big aspect, right? Even if a trait gives you armor or it gives you AP, it gives you AD, it gives you any sort of stat, the trait itself has to be some level of strong or have some level of effectiveness in order to actually work. And that's typically something that makes it that you'll see like traits get buffed and then certain comps become meta, but those are the big sweeping things. The other thing is the quality of the units themselves. The units themselves have abilities and they have effectiveness, right? They have things that either, especially if they're tanks, a lot of times their abilities aren't damage focused. Their abilities or their casting helps them to do something like either they stun or they get some resistances or they gain some sort of durability or some other stat. So the unit quality themselves also plays a factor into evaluating the board. And lastly, there is also a utility aspect of the units. So not only do you have to worry about the traits and the units themselves, the utility that they give the team also makes a big difference to how effective they are in order to like evaluate them as being a strong trait. So now we're going to go through each of the frontline traits and you'll start to see why certain things work out really well for Sentinels as opposed to some of the other frontline traits, and it's why it became more of a popular option, especially when rerolling. Something else that we want to talk about is reroll scaling, which we will leave till the very end. But first we're going to talk about these things and then we'll talk about the reroll scaling. And then you'll start to realize why Sentinels, at least this set, kind of became something really important. And this is supposed to be just more of like a, talk about like the trait type of stuff. But anyways, let's think about Sentinels, right? So if we're talking about Sentinels, the Sentinel trait is actually very strong. Because not only does it give you a bunch of armor, the armor that it gives you is actually quite substantial, especially compared to some of the previous sets that I've played. I felt like, usually like a 2-trait Sentinel or a low trait Sentinel or, equivalent armor. I think last set, it only gave like 10 MR and armor, right? And we're already at like starting with 12, right? This set, Sentinels has felt like it's a little bit overpowered in terms of the amount of armor that it gives. That might be a little bit of placebo, because obviously I'm looking at past sets and past history in order to think of that. But it does feel like you get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of the armor and magic resist. There's also a very important thing where the first couple words matter a lot when you're thinking about the Sentinel trait. And that is your team gains. Your team gains are 3 massive words in TFT, because what this means is that the trait is not just for the units that are on the board. The trait is for the entire board that you have. So your team gains armor and magic resist, and Sentinels gain triple. So when you see these numbers about the armor and MR, not only is it giving your Sentinels a metric shit ton of resistances, which is like a light way of saying it, it's a huge amount of resistances, it also gives those resistances to your rest of your team. So let's say you're playing around a board like Renata Reroll. When you're playing around Renata and Heimer and all of these backline units are gaining some sort of resistances in the form of this armor and MR, right? If you're playing Zeri's gaining extra tankiness. This makes it very good, it's very strong because it makes you less susceptible to getting sniped or getting like, units with backline access like Zoe and LeBlanc, of you dying as easily. You're making your backline units a little bit more tanky, as well as any additional frontline units more tanky. Even when you're playing Sentinel with Tristana, you're giving survivability to your entire board, and that's a really big aspect of these frontline traits that they did in set 13. Now, Sentinel is not the only one that does this. Another one that does that is Bruiser. However, Bruiser does not give you more based on the amount that you're getting. You just get 100 max health flat. So it feels like it's less. It's 100 health to your whole board, which is substantial. If you have 8 units on your board, for example, 100 HP spread across 8 units, that's like a free Warmogs that you get. However, with Sentinel, a lot of times if you're playing deeper into Sentinel, you're getting a large amount of armor on everybody. That feels like it's more than 100 HP, at least as the set has progressed. So Sentinel as itself feels as though it gives you a lot of value for the trait that it is. So when you're evaluating the trait, Sentinel is just generally quite good to give. Now, if we're talking about the units, this is where Sentinels really sets itself apart from the units. And one of the units that is very key is Singed. Now, Singed is getting nerfed in the next patch, so there's obviously going to be changes. I'll mention these. I did the patch review recently, but of the Sentinel units, there is a high amount of quality of the actual Sentinel units compared to some of the other ones, or some of the other frontline traits. Singed is the main reason why you see Zeri Sentinel kind of pop off a lot, as well as like Tristana often in certain cases. A lot of times when you're playing these type of rerolls, especially Renata, a lot of times with Renata, you're usually rolling on level 5 for a Singed 3-star. Now, what makes Singed so great? It's the ability that Singed offers, not the tankiness, not like not him just being there. It's that when Singed casts, he gains durability. So remember, we're talking about the main aspects of a tank. You have durability, you have armor and MR, and you have HP. So he gains durability, which is great. That's one of the aspects of being a tank. So you have 2 out of 3. You have armor and MR from Sentinel, and you have durability from his ability. Additionally, he also grants the ally who dealt the most damage decaying attack speed. So he gives a bunch of attack speed. If you think about all of the reroll comps that you're playing, most of them want your main damage dealer to have attack speed. Think about Zeri. Zeri, you're typically building her with Guinsoo's, so giving her starting attack speed helps her to ramp up those Guinsoo's faster, and it's very effective. So Singed synergizes really well with the Zeri board, and that's why it helps out a lot more than playing a different frontline. Additionally, a Tristana, you're trying to get to her cast as many times as possible to do the explosive damage and just absolutely burn through people. Singed is helping that Tristana gain some attack speed, so it's very important for Tristana as well. A lot of times you'll see Tristana played with some sort of bow item. It's to help her to cast, to get off her ult so that she gets her scaling and blah blah blah, and you know, explosive damage, boom, everybody dies. And especially with Renata, it's also really important. A lot of times with Renata, you're trying to scale up her AP with like a Shojin Archangels, but typically what you want is some other attack speed item. Often it will be a Nashor's Tooth because it's very effective, but also even a QSS is sometimes really common on Renata just for item economy. Like if you have not the items for a Nashor's Tooth and instead you have the items for a QSS, it's often good enough just to get the attack speed from QSS. So any sort of attack speed will help the Renata to cast more. With the Visionary trait, she'll gain more mana. With the more mana gain, she'll continue to cast, and you care a lot about this casting because she shields her allies, right? That's the whole thing with Renata. Usually place her somewhere in the middle. She shields her allies, and with 6 Visionary, she heals, and the shielding constantly up makes it so that the whole team kind of survives really long, and then she ramps up the Archangels, and then she starts one-shotting everybody. That's kind of how this board works. But a lot of that crux of her keeping units alive is tied towards her casting, which is benefited greatly from attack speed from Singed. So now we talked about Singed. That's like one of the one costs, which is usually a throwaway unit, but in a lot of these comps is one of the main staple aspects of playing around Sentinels. Let's think about Rel. So Rel is also quite good with Sentinels because not only does she gains a shield, which kind of works like extra effective HP, but additionally, she also steals armor and magic resist from enemies. Late game, that doesn't matter too much, but early game, it's actually quite substantial because she has an armor reduction and magic resist reduction, so Sunder and Shred, as a utility kind of baked into her kit. It's not a large amount of utility, don't get me wrong. Just because you have a Rel on your board doesn't mean that you get to bypass making a Last Whisper, bypass making a Shiv. You still have to make these Shred and Sunder items in order to maximize your damage. However, she does help to stabilize you early game because she has a good ability. Renata, the unit itself, also, she's just really strong. The amount of shield that she gets, she's a really tanky 2 cost, especially when you upgrade her. A lot of times even a 2-star Renata can live for quite a long time, and 3-star lives unbelievably long. So she's often a very good frontline unit. Additionally, we can go through these with most of the units. I think Leona and Irelia are a little bit weaker in terms of the Sentinels. Loris is similar to Rel, except with a little bit less utility, but he's also very strong. He gains a massive shield and got buffed incredibly over many patches in order to give him more shielding. But one of the big units that you often think about when you're seeing Sentinels is Alawi. Alawi, if you read her trait, she gains durability. So once again, you have a frontline unit that is gaining a bunch of an additional stat that helps them to be a tank. They have a bunch of armor and MR, and then they gain durability. Alawi is also a rebel. If you don't know about rebels, rebels gain a percentage maximum HP just as a flat thing when you have the rebel trait active. So often with an Alawi, you will have a good amount of HP, which will then get scaled up because of the rebel trait. You'll get durability in the form of her ult, and then you also get a massive amount of armor and MR. Additionally, this Alawi, once she casts, she also drains health, which helps her to heal up a little bit. So she has an insane amount of survivability. Whenever she ults, the amount of durability that she gets, as well as all the other resistances and HP that she has, a lot of times the Alawi is so hard to kill. She is always a demon in the front line. And I'm sure if you've played it, a lot of times, even if the board is really weak, you know, like you're playing some sort of like, you know, Rebel without a Jinx board, the Alawi is still going to be a really hard thing to deal with. Finally, if we have to talk about one of the most broken units in the game, it's Rumble. Rumble is one of the best 5 costs and one of the best damage dealers in the game. He is incredibly tanky, he does incredible damage, and a lot of times finding an early Rumble is an indicator that you can play for a first because he scales really well into late game based on the amount of upgrades that he has. Obviously, without many upgrades, the Rumble is kind of like, whatever, but he has an insanely high cap to a lot of boards. So now we're playing a trait where we have multiple frontline units that can work really well early game, work really well into late game, have good utility, have good survivability, and then we also have a trait that they can then cap out really high with an extremely powerful 5 cost. So overall, Sentinels seems like it has no misses. If you're trying to think about what is my max cap kind of board that I can play, Sentinels doesn't really have anything that's like lackluster in almost any way, shape, or form. And that's a big aspect of why Sentinels is really important, or really common, especially with reroll lines. But there is one other thing, which we'll talk about a little bit shortly. But first, I just want to talk about some of the other traits, just so that we don't forget about them. But we will come back to this. There is one other key aspect that makes Sentinels extremely good for reroll, which we will come back to, like I said. Watchers now. Let's talk a little bit about Watchers. If you think about Watchers, Darius is more like a pseudo damage dealer. He's not really built more like a tank. He's built more like a frontline attack unit that he's trying to do damage. He could be a really good tank, don't get me wrong. But the problem with his main kit is that he doesn't really like get extra tankiness. He's more of a damage dealer. He does damage and he heals a little bit, right? So a lot of times if you're building him as a main tank, you're usually hoping to have him hit as many units as possible to apply his bleed effect to try and do as much damage as possible to try and burst people down a lot of the time. Amumu has a pretty good ability and also got a bit buffed where he reduces incoming damage, which kind of plays into his durability trait, but both of these units as 1 cost don't have as much utility as the 1 cost in the form of Singed. So a lot of times your 1 cost Watchers aren't like the most powerful or typically like your main reroll itemized character that you would want to play around. Vlad, very commonly played, obviously, but it has mostly like a healing effect and a damage dealing effect. So far we're seeing a trend. A lot of these low cost units, they're not gaining extra tankiness, but instead they're trying to supplement the damage of your board. So it's often harder to build around these units because you're more so like, you know, not trying to like strictly make them as a giga tank, if that makes sense. Vander, however, is one of the units that is really high quality, right? A lot of times when people have a Vander, whether it's gloves off or whether it's not gloves off, Vander is very hard to kill. And that's because his main effect is that he gains a bunch of armor and magic resist. We can see a trend kind of with some of these units. A lot of the ones that are really hard to deal with and really hard to kill often have abilities that supplement their traits. So now you have a unit that has a Watcher activated, so it gets a bunch of durability, and then gains a bunch of armor and magic resist. And then he also does an effect where he deals damage. Scar is similar in that Scar also gains an extra effect, where he heals a bunch. He also has a stun, which makes him very heavily good in utility. But the main Watcher unit that you normally play around is somebody like Garen, because Garen just has a massive effect where he does he spreads over extra HP using his emissary trait. So a lot of times a standalone Garen can greatly buff a board, and that's why Garen is like the main go-to Watcher unit. But if you compare a lot of these Watcher units in general, most of them don't really have like sort of like giga tank ability or potential unless you start to realize their potential with items. And the problem is, if you're trying to play around a vertical Watcher frontline, you're not going to have items for every single one of these units. So a lot of times, like the main Watcher units that you try and play around is Vander, who is pretty hard to deal with a lot of the time. Scar, who is a 3 cost, so he's just a very expensive unit, so obviously he's going to have some level of power. And Garen, who you're usually more playing towards when you have, like, you know, full boards of either emissary, or you're trying to play just a 2 Watcher trait and you're playing around Garen himself, not because of the Watcher trait in particular. You're playing him more because of the emissary and the general quality of the unit himself, that he gives a bunch of HP to the units on the left and the right of him, which then allows him to effectively increase the amount of front line that you have with just one unit. He's a very useful unit, so to speak. And now let's talk about Bruisers, right? Bruisers, Step has a bit of a healing effect, which is great, but often not really played too heavily around. Trundle is more of like a physical attack damage dealer, where he's healing and doing physical damage. Set has a stun, which is very powerful, but he's stunning mostly just a frontline unit, so he's not doing that much and mostly doing damage and stunning. Nunu has an ability where he gains a bunch of durability, and it's also getting buffed a little bit. Nunu himself is hard to play around, however, because his traits aren't the greatest a lot of the time, right? Because of Experiment, it's harder to play around Experiment often. So you usually see Nunus when you're playing around Visionaries, but we'll talk about why with Visionaries you usually play other units and not Nunu as a main tank. Nunu himself also feels pretty underpowered. I'm not sure if Bruisers in general, like the amount of HP that they get is a little bit like underpowered. It feels like it doesn't perform as well, or if it's Nunu himself is maybe understated in some way. I feel like Nunu dies very early even when you do have a Nunu 3. Now, the main units when you see the Bruisers and you think, wow, these units are absolutely massive. Rennie is a monster because Rennie has a stun similar to Set, but while doing this stun, she also heals. So she has a huge amount of survivability being this melee bruiser, and her healing is based off of her HP, or in part scaled with her HP. So she actually heals a massive amount if you put in a vertical bruiser trait. Additionally, this is very similar to, like, you know, if you play a Rennie and you play a Nunu, a lot of times the Rennie outlives the Nunu with similar items. I feel like just the amount of damage that she does and the amount of healing that she does compensates for her not having like a trait or an innate ability that gives her, like, you know, extra armor or durability similar to like how Nunu works. But whenever you think about Bruisers, the main one that you think about is Elise. And the reason you think about Elise is because her stun is massive. Unlike the Rennie stun and the Set stun, the main utility that you get from Elise is so massive that a lot of times you're just playing Elise strictly for the stun. A lot of times the best items on Elise is stuff like Adaptive Helm or Protector's Vow. You're trying to put mana items on her because you care mostly about her cast, not because of her being a massively amazing tank, but mostly because she stuns the backline. She jumps towards a web where it's like, you know, the maximum amount of groups or a nearby hex within 2 hexes. So a lot of times if you position her well, she can stun the backline units, and that will actually sway the fight one way or another. So even though these traits aren't played that often, there are units like Elise and Garen that are very popular. Garen's a little bit less popular because sometimes he's hard to fit in because he's Emissary. So sometimes if you're playing a board that has another Emissary unit, so think Tristana, think Nami, like a lot of times unless you're playing 4 Emissary, it's hard to fit in Garen very easily, despite how strong he is. So often, the main contested unit is Elise. Form Swapper, very easy to fit in. 3 traits that are all very popular. Bruiser isn't that popular, but it is nice to just have it in there. And it's mostly because of the stun. So that's where Elise falls in. So I'm not trying to say that Bruisers are unplayable and Watchers are unplayable. God knows I've played these lines multiple times, and there are other variations that play it. But overall, the quality of the units and the effects that they give you, minus 1 or 2 in the trait, isn't as well spread as all of the effects that you get and the high cap that you can get through playing or angling yourself towards Sentinels, which is part of the reason why Sentinels is really strong. But remember, there was one thing that I left out. Now, we see Sentinels a lot. They're not played on every single comp, but they're mostly played on reroll comps. So if you think about it, like Renata reroll, Zeri reroll, Tristana reroll. And why are they always played on reroll comps in particular? Why are they favored on rerolls? When you 3-star a unit, this is the last key aspect, right? So I'm going to talk about 3 stars. 3-star units get boosted stats, but a large portion of the stats that a 3-star unit gets is HP. That's one of the big things. So remember when we were talking about tanks, what makes a good tank? HP, armor, and armor MR, and durability / those other additional stats. When you're playing around Sentinels, a lot of times when you're rerolling them, there are 2 costs in these comps. If you look at a lot of these reroll boards, they're mostly 2-cost rerolls, right? You're either playing Renata reroll, you're playing Zeri reroll, or you're playing Tristana reroll. So it benefits you to often roll around the 2 costs. So Watchers have 2 costs, so you can often roll Vander and Vladimir. But Bruisers only has 1 2-cost in the form of Set, so it's often a little bit harder to play around Bruisers if you're doing a 2-cost reroll. So if you're doing a 2-cost reroll, you're probably trying to play around Watchers or you're trying to play around Sentinels. So with Sentinels, you get a bunch of armor and MR, and then when you scale them up to 3 stars, you get a bunch of HP. And the HP and the armor is often much easier to come by, or is much easier to realize the potential of a tank than it is with the durability. Now, obviously, durability is very important, and they can be quite effective, but the problem with durability, especially with Watchers, is that they also drop if they're below 50% health. So sometimes you can get into a point where you're getting very little durability, especially if you're playing around the Watchers and they're not fully upgraded. So it's a little bit more temperamental. But one key aspect is that Watchers are going to get buffed in the next patch. So I wouldn't be surprised if Watchers start to make a little bit of a comeback, because there was a small buff to the Watcher trait in general. Watchers is very common, don't get me wrong. If you're playing around a Vander like Gloves Off 3-star, or you're playing around different lines, sometimes the Watcher units do make a big difference. Zeri with Watchers is often something that is played, but it's considered to be the lower cap version of Zeri Reroll. This used to be more common before, but now just by the effectiveness, as people started to catch on, the extra HP that you get, in addition to all of the armor and MR that you get from playing Sentinels, is just way too effective to pass up on. Which is why, for many reasons, Sentinels became the go-to trait. So, Watchers, still good with Zeri, don't get me wrong, you can play Watcher Zeri, but a lot of times you're playing this just because everybody's contesting Sentinels, maybe they're all playing Renata, so you get a free pass at upgrading the Watchers instead, because, you know, if you're rolling for a different 2 cost and everybody's rolling for the other 2 costs, then you can more easily play around those units. It's the same with something like Tristana. Sometimes with Tristana, people will play Tristana with Bruisers, right? But it's not because the Bruisers is particularly strong. It's mostly just because with the Bruiser variation of these boards, it's just uncontested. Right, if you can hit Tristana 3 for free, and you can hit Set 3 for free, and maybe you hit like a Rennie 3, often this will be like good enough, and you can often get a first or a second just based on hitting more easily than the people that are contesting Sentinel. But one of the key aspects of the Sentinels being strong is the 3-star effect. Right, when you 3-star a unit, they get more base HP. They also get some other base stats, but in general, the HP that you get from 3-starring is very large and very effective, so it works really well to upgrade the units. Additionally, because of the armor and MR and HP, a lot of times it makes it very effective to go for multiple 3-stars. If you compare it to both Bruisers and Watchers, right, Bruisers and Watchers, when you have a Bruiser, without the armor and MR, a lot of these units die very easily, right? Nunu 3 without items is pretty much useless and just dies instantly. Steb 3 and Trundle 3 also die very easily without items, because without any resistances or durability, they often just get picked off very easily. The same with Watchers, right? Your non-3-star units, or even some of your 3-star units, if they don't have items, they often can get picked off very easily because the durability doesn't feel as effective with the HP without any resistances. The Sentinels, a lot of them, they're just hard to deal with in general, because with the amount of HP that you get for 3-starring the unit, as well as the amount of armor that you get for having 6 Sentinel in, is massive. And you also have the potential to cap really high, because if you're playing deep into this trait, you also can play around Rumble. We didn't even talk about scrap shielding as being another form of tankiness for Rumble, but a lot of times you can get a lot of effective HP with the Rebel inter-Sentinel synergy. You can get a lot of effective HP with the Rumble with the inter-Sentinel scrap synergy, and then you can also get a lot of effective HP by playing the reroll variation. So when you try and cap out this board, you have a lot of HP, a lot of HP, a lot of HP, and then you have a giga hyper late game carry that can absolutely like 1v9 everybody if you get enough upgrades on him to cap out the board later. So how does this get remedied? Obviously, the traits getting a little bit better and the units getting a bit better is something that you commonly see. We already saw in the most recent patch at TFT, Nunu got quite big buffs, like around a 10% durability buff overall with his casting. We saw Vander get buffed, right? I don't think Vander needed a buff. I think maybe some of the other Watchers did, but Vander got a couple buffs as well. The Watcher trait got a couple buffs. These are things that are obviously getting fixed over time. But it's the reason that things just kind of exploded was because it was basically like a sum of all its parts, right? All of the frontline traits and all of the units all have their use in the game, and they all have potential to do really well and do great things. It's just that there's so many reasons that Sentinels kind of can like skew above, that when you start to dig a little bit deeper into it, you start to see, okay, that's the making of why so many rerolls end up playing around Sentinels. And this isn't something just like opinion based, it's something that you can actually verifiably see in stats. A lot of times if you're playing around Zeri, it's often tied with Sentinels. If you're playing around Tristana now, it's often tied with Sentinels. And if you're playing around Renata, obviously it's tied within Sentinels. So Sentinels probably will continue to be a very popular trait, just because there's too many things that are good with it, right? There's too many ways to cap out really high, too many ways to get effective tankiness out of it, and then the utility from Sentinels is just so much more effective a lot of the time. Of course, like I said before, there are units in every, like there are high quality units of every trait that can work very well. There are other tanks as well, like Swain and Form Swappers and like Automata that got buffed. So there's obviously other tanks as well. It's just a matter of how much effective board strength you get for playing around Sentinels. And that's kind of what the video I wanted to do today was. But whenever you evaluate any trait, right, you always have to evaluate your units in multiple ways. And I was hoping that would come across in this video, right? Looking at trait, looking at the quality of the units, and then looking at how the units actually affect and help out your board. So thank you for watching. Hopefully that was a fun video. Tomorrow and the day after, we're going to start doing some reviews of maybe some of the new upcoming comps that might be a little bit more meta. On Wednesday, I'll do like these are the best comps or quote unquote good comps to climb ranked with. And then on the Thursday and after, I'm probably going to do a family guide and a pit fighter guide that I'll probably combine because they're going to be very intertwined, because family reroll looks like it's going to be something that's, you know, it's probably going to be pretty good come this Wednesday. So be prepared for those. Thank you for watching and have a great day, and see ya. Bye bye.